The bottom line is that Israel is on the front line of a fight that I think affects all of us. They're doing nothing any differently to any other army when it comes to defending what happened after 7th of October. I've been, I guess, unfortunate enough to have seen a lot more of the evidence from 7th of October than most Israelis have. And it's the most horrifying thing I've ever seen, including anything I saw in Afghanistan. So really sort of standing up for Israel. It's not unconditional. I'm happy to say when I think they've got things wrong, but the bottom line is there's a blood libel going on. And this is not a genocide by any stretch of the imagination. And I'm very happy to go in hard on that particular part of the argument, because Israel is fighting a just war of national self-defense.
Andrew Fox, thank you for speaking to the Australian Jewish News. Can you tell our viewers a bit about your background and what made you feel compelled to defend Israel?
So I did 16 years in the British Army. I left as a major in the Parachute Regiment, which is our airborne infantry. I did 3 tours in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Middle East, Northern Ireland. And since then, I've been an academic. So I now work for the Henry Jackson Society in London. My areas of expertise are the Middle East, defence and disinformation. So looking at the psychology of disinformation and why our brains are so easily lied to. And really what we saw in the Middle East was a bit of a perfect storm for me, because it was a war in the Middle East with loads of strategic questions and loads of disinformation. So it sort of quite aligned with my expertise. And really, I was very fortunate to be invited to Israel. I'd spent the month since 7th of October really fighting anti-Semitism more than anything else. I saw that explosion of anti-Semitism on our streets. There was a lot of Jewish friends of mine who were very affected by it. So I had a small platform, and I felt obliged to use it to speak out against this. And that got me an invitation to Israel. And then, because of my veteran status and the military experience and background I have, that kind of opened a lot of doors. And the IDF took me into Gaza 3 times. I went into Lebanon. I was with Yahalom exploring a Hezbollah tunnel just north of Avivim in Marine Al Ras. And the reason I stand up for Israel in this conflict is because I genuinely think they're in the right from everything I've seen. I've got a level of expertise most people don't have. I've got a level of academic background in this exact topic that most people don't have, and I've got the military experience to understand what I'm looking at. And when the IDF explains to me what they're doing, I've got a good ability to say whether I think they're telling the truth or not by looking at what's actually happening on the ground. And look, I'll be honest, if I thought Israel was committing genocide, I would absolutely say so. It's not a knee-jerk must support Israel regardless. And I've been quite critical in some cases of Israel during the war. Some of the sort of strategic moves that have been made. But the bottom line is that Israel is on the front line of a fight that I think affects all of us. They're doing nothing any differently to any other army when it comes to defending what happened after 7th of October. I've been, I guess, unfortunate enough to have seen a lot more of the evidence from 7th of October than most Israelis have. And it's the most horrifying thing I've ever seen, including anything I saw in Afghanistan. So really sort of standing up for Israel. It's not unconditional. I'm happy to say when I think they've got things wrong, but the bottom line is there's a blood libel going on. And this is not a genocide by any stretch of the imagination. And I'm very happy to go in hard on that particular part of the argument, because Israel is fighting a just war of national self-defense.
Can I ask you, you've had extraordinary access, which the IDF has granted you, to enter Gaza several times, and you've researched the death toll in the Gaza Strip and written a comprehensive report on the fatality statistics. Can you just summarize your findings?
Yes, of course. So it all comes from the fact that I've called for airstrikes on buildings myself, and I know how incredibly difficult it is to count casualties accurately in any sort of speed or pace. And nonsense alarm went up when you had this ticking death toll minute by minute that was coming out from the Gaza Ministry of Health. And I knew that couldn't be correct. It's just not that easy to do. If you think about the way you have to look through rubble, if you think about the damage that's done to the human body by an airstrike, putting that puzzle together takes time, especially when there are still bombs flying around. So I knew it couldn't be right. So I dug into it, and really, I took a very different approach to all the other studies. There's lots of people out there kind of using statistical modelling to forecast stuff, or working hand in hand with the Hamas Ministry of Health, which means they're completely compromised, and they're simply complicit with Hamas. I simply took what's called a qualitative approach rather than a quantitative approach. So rather than try and look at the raw numbers, I was looking for errors and trends. Uh, uh, Not to give a conclusive total or a conclusive figure, but instead to say, look, there's loads wrong here. This is a bit suspect, and the world's media should not be relying on this as gospel truth. So we found men listed as women, women listed as men, loads of adults listed as children. We found deaths from before the war. And in total, it wasn't, a decisive, we can reduce the figure down to this number, but it was enough to say there was enough wrong. And then 3 months later, Hamas themselves deleted 3,500 names due to the inaccuracies. So that was very validating. One of the other things we looked at was the previous conflicts in Gaza to see if there were any kind of parallels we could find. And what we found broadly was that the IDF are generally in agreement with Hamas on the overall totals. There's a bit of variation, but it's not a wild thousands and thousands variation. The big difference, of course, is that Hamas don't report combatants. And I think that's a really telling thing, because if you look at Lebanon, if you look at Hezbollah, they were pushing out those very glamorous death photos of all their fighters and leaders, and you see that regularly in other places as well. But Hamas have always concealed their fighter and combatant deaths. And so what we then did was look at what the IDF were claiming of combatant deaths to see if that was credible. And that was really difficult because the IDF don't play ball particularly well when it comes to that kind of detail. And we had to work pretty hard to get an answer out of them as to how they count those fatalities. And it turns out, funnily enough, as very often with things the IDF are secretive about, it's absolutely common sense, because they do exactly the same as we do. They have after-action reviews with their troops, they have debriefs, and they come up with a rough total. And the reason they come up with a rough total, it kind of gives the lie to Hamas's numbers as well, because the IDF knows you can't be accurate with this stuff. It's war, it's chaotic. People are under stress, people are under strain, people make mistakes, people miscount. And only once the dust has settled can you start coming up with these numbers in any realistic way. And so that's what the IDF do, and they give you a ballpark figure of 20,000. We looked at the time of publishing anyway, and then we looked back at previous conflicts in Gaza to see how accurate the IDF had been in previous conflicts with their estimates, and they were pretty much bang on, a little bit over, but again, nothing particularly statistically noteworthy. So that's what we're looking at. It, like I said, it was, rather than digging into the individual detail, we're looking for patterns and trends, and then Hamas proved us completely right 3 months later.
So it's interesting because there's been a kind of pattern throughout the war that Hamas has not been held to account for the disaster that's befallen the people of Gaza. You very, very rarely see any public demands on Hamas, but you see relentless demands on the IDF. Why do you think that is? Why has Hamas just been taken out of the culpability issue?
I think Hamas have taken themselves out. They have run, by any standards, a masterful propaganda campaign. Abu Ubaidah, a deeply evil man, but incredibly good at what he did. And he has, manipulated the world's media brilliantly. Now, the IDF have made errors here. Not allowing journalists in, I support, but I think they really should have had more, maybe people like me, or maybe more journalists embedded with frontline troops to actually see the fight as it was going through, and see the IED threat, and see the tunnels as almost in real time. It's difficult to do, but you can do it, and I've seen many armies do that in other conflicts. Unfortunately, by completely barring all international journalists, what that did was concede the information space to Hamas. And I spoke to an IDF general about this, and his line was, "I don't have time for the media war. I'm fighting a real war." And my counterpoint would be that actually the information war is now, in 2025, in the age of social media, a critical part of the ground war, because we've seen Hamas's ability to actually have tactical effect on the ground using international propaganda. And the best example is the 4-month pause between the Khan Yunis operation and the Rafah operation between January and April 2024. That 4-month delay was effectively imposed by the White House due to humanitarian concerns. And yet, in the end, Rafah was evacuated not only by the IDF, but by Hamas too. And civilian deaths were incredibly low there because there was just nobody there when the IDF went through it. The only people there were Hamas fighters or those few poor people who couldn't afford to, too ill to move or whatever it might be. So Hamas's propaganda caused that 4-month delay. It gave Hamas the space on the ground to change their tactics and put explosives in every building and set ambushes for the IDF. And absolutely, IDF soldiers died because Hamas propaganda had that 4-month delay. The international community is culpable as well. I think the UN has revealed itself as an organization that historically they've always been vastly more condemnatory of Israel than any other country, no matter who. Afghanistan,
Much
Taliban,
more than
Iran, it
Iran.
doesn't matter.
Just doesn't make any sense.
Well, it
It's
does if you
deeply
look at
corrupt,
how many.
obviously.
Well, it does if you look at what percentage of the UN is now dictatorships. It's close to 70% non-democratic countries. And that unfortunately has severely tipped the balance of their output. And the UN genocide report most recently is the best example. 3 on record anti-Semites, not just anti-Zionists or anti-Israeli campaigners. They have lost jobs because of their positions towards Jews in the past, and they are long-standing anti-Israel campaigners. The document they pushed out was a nonsense. It doesn't cover the intent of genocide even remotely because there is none. And yet that now gives, of course, what we call the halo effect, because it comes from the wonderful United Nations, who are a force for good in the world. That report carries weight, unfortunately. And by not fighting the information war and not forefronting Hamas and not forefronting the way they've sacrificed Gaza's civilians on purpose for this propaganda campaign, by not really showing the world 7th of October, most people don't understand how horrendous it was. By not fighting that information war, I think I would actually say that a lot of the blame for the criticism of Israel is the responsibility of the government of Israel, because they've just not fought the information war in the way that modern countries need to in 2025.
I wanted to ask you also about the question of Egypt, another elephant in the room that seems to get a bit of a pass on all these issues. Obviously has a large border with Gaza. People forget that Israel is only one of the borders. What is going on there, in your opinion? I've asked other experts, and I don't get a clear visual. I have a feeling that it's a mixture of fear politically that the peace treaty will collapse with Egypt, fear of opening up another front with another Arab neighbor. What do you think is going on? Because, of course, we know that if they'd opened up safe passage for Gazan civilians to flee at the beginning of this war, thousands of lives most probably could have been saved. So why are they allowed to lock out the Gazan refugees? And have you seen another conflict where civilians are locked into a war zone?
No, and I think that is the headline here, is that this is the only war zone in the world where not only are the civilians not allowed to flee, but also their government is effectively trying to get them killed so they can have propaganda gains. It's quite astonishing. And Hamas are on record as saying this. I wrote a report for the Henry Jackson Society called Hamas's Human Shield Strategy, and it goes into what Hamas said they were going to do in great detail, and they've done it. But when it comes to Egypt, there's competing tensions here. So firstly, there's regional Arab tensions, where the Palestinian cause is a totemic cause in the Arab world. It's deeply important, and there is, I think, a fear that if Gazan civilians fled, they wouldn't be allowed back. So that's the first one. There's the Arab kind of tension. The second one is the Muslim Brotherhood factor. If we go back to the Arab Spring and what happened in Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood election, and then the military kind of coup afterwards, Egypt has worked exceptionally hard to reduce Muslim Brotherhood influence in Egypt. And of course, Hamas is a Muslim Brotherhood organization. So I think they are wary of letting in a very strong Muslim Brotherhood influence. 2 million kind of adherence to that would be a challenge for Egypt. They've also been working very hard to pacify Sinai, that they've had a real insurgency problem there. And of course, any Gazans coming into Egypt would have to go through there, which gives all kinds of potential for destabilization of Egypt. So I can kind of understand where the Egyptians are coming from. I don't agree with it, of course, but I think the reasons are pretty clear. And then finally, I think there is a kind of double level here because not only did Egypt seize the border, but they then also joined the genocide case against Israel in the ICJ. So they're the only country in the world who could have stopped the genocide and joined the genocide case. Instead of doing anything about it, they reinforced their border. They didn't just hold it, they reinforced it. So, there's a variety of factors coming into play here, but those are the sort of the key ones that I can see.
Wouldn't they have set up a massive kind of refugee camp that was, built to contain the population so that they're not straying around Egypt? They're in an isolated place in the Sinai desert, but allow them to live there in safety while the war is raging in Gaza.
Essentially, that doesn't that doesn't address the issue of Arab concerns about the ability to go back and you know, the fact that Gaza can be used as a stick against Israel. So the last thing they want is to empty it of Arabs who can, perhaps never return. So that doesn't address that problem. And then secondly, there is of course the issue of providing humanitarian aid like that for 2 million people. That is a monstrous undertaking, and I didn't see any kind of international groundswell of support for that idea. I don't think it's something Egypt could have done on their own. But the idea was never really put on the table.
But if you are genuinely wanting to save lives on the ground and you're not disingenuous, isn't the priority to save lives, to get innocent people out of harm's way and to accommodate them, whatever it costs? And quite frankly, I'm sure that Israel would be more than happy to provide the aid that they were providing to Gaza, but to provide it into an area that the refugees were living in, as long as it wasn't within Israel, obviously. I don't understand why. It just seems like as usual, the Palestinian population are being used and manipulated, and the world, rather than calling out the injustice of it, just from a humanitarian point, I mean, forget the politics, forget the future, just saving lives of so-called innocent people who should be able to flee like they have in Ukraine, like they have in every other war, people, including millions and millions of Jews who have had to flee Europe and the Arab world for that matter. Many could have been saved. Isn't that the priority here, rather than playing politics with people's lives?
Well, I think you're falling into what we call the Wickhamist fallacy, where you assume that people think like us, and I don't think the Arab world sees it that way. The value of life is certainly not um, as treasured, perhaps in that part of the world as it is in the West. And I think the answer to this is actually in your question. You said if they weren't disingenuous and if they really cared about Palestinians. Well, I think they are disingenuous, and I don't think they actually care about Palestinian lives. They care
Mm.
about the issue of Palestine as a means of holding something over Israel and having that ability not to accept what happened in 1947-48. It's, it all goes back to that, the war that happened immediately afterwards with all those Arab countries launching at Israel. And that's not a defeat they've ever taken kindly. And they're thinking in decades and even
Mm.
half centuries or centuries here. If they lose those footholds that surround Israel, be it
Mm.
West Bank, Judea, Samaria, or Gaza, then that makes Israel an awful lot stronger and an awful lot more secure. And that's the one thing they find far more important than anything else, is to keep Israel in that kind of delicate balance. So
Mm.
they are absolutely prioritizing long-term kind of
Gain
political,
and
strategic
strategy.
considerations ahead of Gazans' lives. And I think in private they might be even a bit more explicit about that than they are in public.
Israel's received unprecedented scrutiny and criticism on its conduct in Gaza since launching its military action following the atrocities that were committed on the 7th of October. I mean, obviously, it's easy to criticize Israel from afar, but as a military expert, if you were the chief of staff of the IDF on the 8th of October, how would you have prosecuted this war?
It's a really interesting one, and I'm slightly torn because I've had interviews just this week with both Yoav Gallant and Yossi Cohen, the former head of Mossad. So having had both of them in my ear for a good few hours, I can see kind of both sides of this. So the Gallant position was that Lebanon was the bigger threat, that Hezbollah was the bigger threat, and they had the ability to take out 15,000 Hezbollah fighters on 11th of October 2023, and that's what Israel should have done. Whereas Yossi was, essentially laughed at that idea because you still had Hamas fighters running around Israel. You still had unknown numbers of hostages being dragged into Gaza, and clearly that should have been the priority from his perspective. Uh, in terms of the actual military conduct of the war, I think the strategy was almost flawless up to kind of really the sacking of Gallant, sort of midway through last year. I think the IDF operational design was complicated because the strategy wasn't as clear as it might be. So the IDF military strategy had to be really good, and it was. Just to disambiguate for anyone watching, you have political strategy, which is the end goal, which is what's set by Jerusalem, what's set by the politicians, and the military strategy is the armed component part of that. And if we look at what wars are for, wars are a lever of politics. You carry out a military campaign for a political end state, and the political end state, I think, with Gaza has never been that clear. We still don't know what the day after looks like. We still don't know who's going to run Gaza. We still don't know what's going to happen with Hamas and their influence. So there's all these questions, and that makes the military strategy really hard to write because you actually don't know what end you're working towards. So the IDF developed this operational strategy where they would punch into the city areas, so Gaza City, Rafah, and Khan Yunis. They'd clear what they could, and then they'd withdraw. And that was, I think, the clever thing to do because, look, the odds of utterly destroying every element and every part of Hamas are very low by military force alone. They're too embedded. That they have support from outside the country. They have the ability just to hide amongst the civilian population. You're not going to get rid of every last one, but what you can do is stop them from being a threat to Israel ever again. And then it doesn't matter what's happening in Gaza because you can always strike back in at another date, drop an airstrike if you see military activity. And by avoiding the ground holding, they avoided that sort of insurgency piece that we saw in Basra or Baghdad during the 2003 Iraq War. So I think that was quite clever. What I'm slightly more skeptical about is the stuff since the ceasefire in January. I think in terms of achieving strategic goals, it's doing far more damage now to Israel on the international stage than it is winning Israel gains on the tactical battle on the ground. So you can kill all the goons. That's great. And I've got no moral or intellectual objection to just killing members of Hamas because, frankly, there are few people in the world that deserve it more. But my bigger concern is that the isolation Israel is facing on the international stage is a greater strategic threat to Israel than Hamas ever could be now. They've been absolutely obliterated on the battlefield. Their capability to hit Israel is now non-existent. And it's only really the issue of the hostages that's the problem. And I'll go back to what Yoav Gallant said. His original goal was set the conditions to return the hostages, which is very different because what he's saying is use military force to put your boot on Hamas's throat and drive them to the negotiating table. My main criticism over this war would be pointed firmly at the political echelon in Israel. I think a lot of the decisions they've made don't make a huge amount of sense to me.
What do you think victory looks like? Do you think victory is attainable?
I'm not sure victory is a helpful term, actually. I think, if we're talking about Ukraine, for example, victory is very clear. One army will be defeated. In Gaza, one army is already defeated. Like Hamas are obliterated. They've got, I think perhaps potentially one battalion left intact, but I'm skeptical about that as well. This is, by all military metrics, an overwhelming victory for Israel and an overwhelming defeat for Hamas. But then we look at it from a strategic perspective, and the picture changes very, very differently because we have Hamas having actually achieved a lot of their strategic goals, which are, political strategic goals. They've achieved an isolation of Israel. They've achieved pressure internally on Israeli society by fomenting protests on the streets over the hostages and protests over the conduct of the war. They have elevated the Palestinian cause to a level that it has never been at before. Unprecedented global support for what not only the Palestinian cause is, but also for what Hamas did on 7th of October. So military victory is assured, done. It's a done deal. Strategic success or strategic defeat is still hanging in the balance, I would say. The question is what next for Israel on the international stage. We're seeing Israeli sports teams thrown out of competitions. We're seeing organizations like the Heinrich Jab Foundation in The Hague. They have artificial intelligence trawling Israeli social media to find IDF soldiers traveling abroad, and then they're bringing private prosecutions or legal, criminal prosecutions against them in the countries they go on holiday to. You've got former allies now recognizing the state of Palestine. This is a real problem for Israel. So really the ultimate victory will be trying to pull it back from that brink, I suspect, rather than the military brink, which is a done deal.
Now, I wanted to pivot for a second to more domestic issues. You're obviously from England with that wonderful accent of yours. I wanted to ask you about what's happening at home, because I, I don't know whether I'm imagining this or whether it's social media that I'm falling victim to, but it seems like basically Jews around the world and non-Jews have watched and scratched their heads and yelled at their TVs in frustration as they've watched the endless dissemination of lies by mainstream media and government bodies around the world. Not only lies about Israel, but lies about their own domestic issues. It feels like these once trusted news providers have turned against their own societies, and millions around the world are coming to the realization that for some reason, these once respected and trusted institutions are simply lying to them and spreading misinformation. And there's been so many of these things, genocide in Gaza and all these falsehoods and lies, but it seems so much bigger than you can't even put your finger on it anymore. It's coming from so many different places. It's coming from governments. It's coming from news outlets that we used to respect and trust. What is going on here?
So that's a huge question to unpack. So my podcast, The Brink, it's thebrinkpodcast.co.uk. We interviewed Barry Weiss just last week. And she had a great line, and it's that the issue isn't an issue of trust, it's an issue of trustworthiness. And I thought that was quite profound. And the issue we have is that lack of trustworthiness is causing people to look for alternate news sources, and traditional media is in a scramble to try and keep its old role going. And that's leading, I think, to a kind of groupthink. I think in many cases there's malign influence. There's definitely money from malign actors that are going into news organizations and subverting it.
Have we got
But there's
evidence of that?
also,
Because everyone talks about Qatar funding this, funding that. We know we've got evidence on university campuses.
well, look who funded the weather reports on Sky News for the last 10 years. It's Qatar Airways. And we can't talk about cause and effect, but I think we can certainly look at some of their output and suggest it's deeply dodgy. Whether that's because they're financially subverted or just because they're bad journalists, I don't know. I'm not going to commit to that. Certainly not where I could get sued. But there is definitely something very skewed in that channel's reporting of Israel, particularly. And then we look at the BBC, and it's an institutional groupthink. They've spent a decade recruiting the same type of person who embraces a certain political worldview. And then it's very difficult for people to break out of that groupthink when they're presented with a narrative they all agree with. Look at the foreign correspondents you see in Tel Aviv. Now, I'm friends with a number of them, but they all go out together, they all go drinking together, they all socialize together. And again, it creates that groupthink mentality. So the challenge is really breaking through that. And the trustworthiness we're seeing here is the challenge. We're in a battle for the narrative. And what we've lost in many ways through open borders, through the erosion of the nation state in favor of supranational organizations, be that the EU, be that the United Nations, whatever, is that we've lost our narrative, we've lost our national stories, and we've lost an idea of the stories we tell us about ourselves, and we don't know who we are anymore. And I think that's one thing Israel gets really right, is Israel's got a really clear national identity that it doesn't really matter if you're far right or if you're even on the left wing. People understand what Israel is and why it's there and what it stands for. And yes, you do have the odd kind of crazy idea come out from certain elements of the political echelon, but for the most part, everyone gets it.
Mm.
Like, I don't think you have that in the UK anymore. I don't think you have that in Holland, Belgium, Germany, France, because we've, like you say, with open borders and with certain exporting of national functions to supranational bodies, that has inevitably diluted that sense of who we are. And so people are looking for the truth, and they are, I think, in danger of looking in the wrong places for it.
It just seems to me that it's kind of bigger than that. I think obviously Douglas Murray's been talking about the war on the West for a very, very long time. Do you feel like, as a Brit, do you feel like there is a war going on between ideologies and between this lack of nationalism in England? Do you feel like that is on the rise, that people are starting to say, wait a minute, we don't like where this is going. It seems pretty obvious that there's a really, really big problem. So why is this being swept under the carpet by so many when clearly the people are coming up and they're saying now, we don't like where this is going. We want you to deal with this. These are not our values. This is not, we don't feel safe. Listen to us. And they're getting more and more frustrated.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we saw that explosion of British and English flags being flown around the country recently. And actually, no matter what the politics behind it, that was just lovely to see, because I've been on the front lines in Ukraine. You see the Ukrainian flag everywhere. I've been to Israel. You see the Israeli flag everywhere. I spent time in America. You see the Stars and Stripes. You rarely see the UK flag in the UK. I have seen the Palestine flag in the UK more times in the last 2 years than I have the British flag.
That's the point.
Which is mind blowing, isn't it? So, regardless of their motives, I fully support the campaign to show our flag more often and reclaim some of that national story that I mentioned that we seem to have lost. There is clear subversion on an international scale, and you talk about that level of malign interference from foreign actors. I would make a contention that we're in World War III already. There is a realignment of global powers. I think Trump has come along at the worst possible time to destroy America's standing on the world stage. The Pax Americana that we've had since 1945 is now gone. America's not a reliable security ally. And that's going to force Europe to step up, because we're seeing this alignment. We're seeing this malign dictatorship alliance almost. It's not formal. China's strategic aims are not aligned with Russia's strategic aims, and not aligned with Pakistan's strategic aims, and not aligned with Iran's strategic aims. Each of those countries has points of conflict between each other, but they do have a broad goal that they want to do down the West and make themselves more powerful and influential on the world stage. And the way they're doing this is far cleverer than what we conventionally think of as a war. And it ties into what Hamas have done in Gaza, and it's an information battle. They are throwing money at our universities and subverting our academics. They're throwing money at our media companies and doing the same. They're even suborning our politicians. And if you look at how the global recognition of Palestine was brought about, that was coordinated by a Qatari-affiliated progressive think tank, who have key members of staff in Australian, Canadian, British governments, who are also high-profile attendees of their conferences. And the recognition movement aligned with the conferences of this think tank. So, this is happening. We're being attacked societally at so many different levels. And I think, first of all, we need to wake up to it. Secondly, we need to expose it. And third, we need to fight back against it. But there doesn't seem to be the political will to do that quite yet. And so it needs to come from the ground. It needs to come from the grassroots. It needs to come from ordinary people putting pressure on their politicians by either not voting for them or protesting and just saying, look, this needs to change. And only then will it happen, because at the moment we're sleepwalking. We're asleep at the wheel.
It's a big task ahead. If you had a crystal ball, what would you predict will be the situation in 5 years' time?
You see, that's always the hellish question for the analyst, because my job is to analyse stuff that's happening and not go out on a limb and make predictions. But it will go one of two ways. Look, we'll either wake up or we won't. It's as simple as that. And there's so many. It's a really difficult job being an analyst of the field I work in, because there are so many variables.
Yeah.
There are so many different aspects to look at that could change, and any one of them could pivotally change the entire paradigm. So there's all sorts of things that could happen. The UK, for example, our economy could go through the floor. It's entirely possible we might need an IMF bailout in the next 24 months, which could lead to a whole change in government, and then a whole change in direction, which would make a big difference to the way we're approaching this problem, I suspect. Alternatively, we could just stumble through with this pack-handed government that we've got right now. No economic growth, people getting poorer because of inflation, people getting unhappier, and more civil unrest on the streets, as people naturally push back against the things that they perceive are damaging their societies. So there's so many different ways this can go, but it'll go one of two ways. We'll either wake up or we won't. All
right. Well, Andrew Fox, thank you so much for speaking to us. We really appreciate your insights, and we wish you all the best and lots of luck with all your work that you're doing, which is absolutely incredible.
Thank you so much. It was great to chat.